Welcome back to Kaulignation, your one-stop shop for all things Kaulig Racing, Dinger Nation, SVG Nation, NASCAR, and more. Ryan's still on vacation, so believe it or not, for once, I'm not riding solo, but we'll get to that momentarily. If you haven't yet, please check us out on social media. It's at Kaulignation on X, and then on Facebook, we have a few different groups: Kaulignation, Dinger Nation, SVG Nation, which is under construction. And our question for this video, if you watched today's Xfinity race and were paying really close attention to the 97, you might have noticed some pretty significant, experience gains for SVG. How sold are you on SVG's ability to adapt to ovals after today's impressive Darlington performance? There was a moment in the race where he's chasing down Chase Elliott, and they're both on, same tire wear. And Chase Elliott has mentioned multiple times that he's not great at this place and wants to get better at it. But still, this is SVG, very little oval experience. In my opinion, Darlington is one of the hardest oval tracks there is to learn because it's so unique from all the other ones. And he chased him right down and passed him. So that was rather impressive. I believe it was a top 10 finish for him as well. Probably should have been for AJ too if it wasn't for some bad luck there at the end, clipping the 0-0 and getting the flat tire. And sadly, another hard hit. But let us know down in the comment section down below how sold you are on SVG's ability to adapt to ovals. Joining me on this episode, and we are recording at 10 after 11 on the East Coast, so he's very kind to grace us with his time. It's Owen Johnson from Cupstein. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Tired. It's been a long day. Bunch of kids. Birthday party for my daughter. I was able to sneak in the race while barbecuing, so that was cool. What did you think of today's race? Obviously, the Xfinity Darlington race is significantly shorter than the Cup race, but overall, I thought it was a pretty entertaining race.
I agree. I think it put on a good show. Obviously, a really entertaining final couple of laps with the overtime finish. But a good race throughout, and like you say, a really good run for SVG. I think a 7th place finish, so good, strong run for him.
I wasn't sure where he finished. I knew he had made it into the top 10 and was. If you're watching the NASCAR tracker, you can, or right on their website, you can monitor their lap times, and he was running P3, P4 lap times in that last run, so that was quite surprising to me because we get some grief on here from some SVG followers at times, and Ryan and I both love SVG. We think he's great, but we've gotten a bunch of his supercar fans follow our channel as well, and they think that we're a little overly critical at times, and I view it as, well, it's a learning curve, right? I remember AJ Allmendinger coming over from IndyCar, and it's a Red Bull racing car not qualifying for races, and them having to put Mike Skinner in the car just to get it into the field. So sadly, I'm that old, but SVG's performance today just blew me away. I know he's won 3 road courses this year, but for me, this might have been the most impressive performance he's had yet. I don't know if we can expect the same out of the Cup car tomorrow. It just doesn't seem like they have the setup for either one of those guys. But let's dive into the news of the day, man. I've been talking your ear off now for a couple of weeks about the possibility of Christian Eckes signing with Kaulig. That seemed to be the talk for the last little while. No one was, Breakhard on YouTube was definitively saying that it was Christian Eckes, so credit to him. But it was a lot of hinting and finger pointing, but no one definitively saying that they knew it was Eckes. Just they assumed that it might be. Just in general, your thoughts on the signing before we get into the details.
Well, like you say, it was definitely the talk of the garage. It was pretty well known that it was going to be Eckes coming up on the stage earlier today. And what it was announced was a multi-year deal for him driving the number 16 Xfinity Series car for the next couple of years. He is a Truck Series points leader, so he's a very accomplished driver in NASCAR's 3rd-tier series at this point in the playoffs, and he's got 8 wins in his career, I think. And I think he should really benefit that Xfinity Series program. It'd be kind of a leader to build the team around. Chris Rice has talked to me about this week and talked about last week when he signed Daniel Dye, a desire to bring that team back to kind of go trophy hunting again. And I think that Eckes is really a leader who can build a team around him.
Now, you and I talked about this off air a little bit, and it seems like most people have the opinion that the truck drives a little closer to the Cup car and the Xfinity car is kind of off in no one's land or nowhere land, and people love driving it. The drivers speak positively of it, but it's a much different car to drive. So how long do you think it's going to take Eckes to adjust to that? And obviously with Cup being the long-term goal, which we'll get into in a bit, how long do you think the adjustment period will be? I remember when Chandler Smith came over to Kaulig, I thought there'd be an adjustment period, and I think he was in victory lane 5 or 6 races in, almost in victory lane, I think race 2 or 3, and then lost the lead at the end.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I talked to Carson Hocevar about this last week at Daytona, just about how similar the truck and the Cup car drive. He said they both drive off the front tires rather than the rear tires, kind of make similar high downforce style of driving. But the Xfinity car is a lot like the older style of Cup cars. It really is that old platform. So I agree with you. It seems like it should be a little bit harder to adapt, but for some reason I feel like with the exception of Hocevar, a lot of the drivers from the truck series, like Zane Smith, have struggled to adapt in the Cup series, whereas a lot of the drivers, like you point out, Chandler Smith, adapt very quickly from the trucks to the Xfinity car. So for whatever reason, I don't expect that long a period of adaptation, but I do think we're going to have to expect, he won't be the points leader, I don't think, next year. I think that'd be a little bit too much to hope for.
For sure. I think if he's competing for some wins here and there and making the playoffs, they'd be quite happy with that. I look at Christian Eckes, and you look at the prospects in NASCAR, and maybe I'm overselling him here, but I felt this way before he had signed, which is why I'd wanted them to make a run at him, is when you look at drivers outside of the Cup Series, I don't know if anybody has had the pedigree that Christian Eckes has. Now, some will argue, Corey Heim absolutely dominated ARCA, but some would also argue the competition and the equipment difference may have not been on equal footing there. So Corey Heim's obviously up there. There's a bunch of other guys as well. But like Eckes has 15 top 10s this year in the truck series. And the one race that he doesn't have a top 10 in, there was an equipment issue. He's won 3 times this year. Top 5s, I believe there's 11 or 12 of them. Like, his performance has been dominant this year. He seems like he's a guy ready to make the step to a point. Just, you go back 2 months ago, and Bob Pockras was talking about him as a possibility for the Kaulig 31 or 16, or even a front row car in Cup. So does it surprise you at all that Eckes is making the stop in Xfinity first, or does funding kind of play a big role in him having to make that Xfinity stop first?
Well, it definitely doesn't surprise me that he's moving up. I think on a head-to-head comparison, you talk about Corey Heim, Eckes is leading him in the points. Now, Heim has more wins in the truck series this year, but Eckes has been more consistent overall, has had overall stronger performances, and is the points leader. So I think he is really one of the top prospects. But I think one of the big things with front row especially is Eckes is a Chevy driver. I think he was the best Chevy driver Kaulig really could have gotten, best Chevy driver on the market right now. But I think that probably guides why he's at Kaulig rather than a front row team or somewhere else like that. He's been pretty loyal to the manufacturer. And Chevy says, he's with McAnally Hilgeman Racing. Kaulig says they're committed to their Chevy teammates with McAnally, which is why they're not bringing him up for any part-time Xfinity Series starts to bring out the season. They want him to focus on getting that truck championship for their Chevy kind of teammate team. So I think it's in the Chevy pipeline, and I think a Kaulig Xfinity ride is probably a whole lot better than a Kaulig Cup ride at this point in time, just where the cars are running. So I think it's probably the best fit seat for him as he looks to move up in the series for the time being.
For sure, I totally agree. Chris Rice told a story on the live stream that I had seen about, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'd like your take on it, that I might have missed some of it, but that AJ, Chris Rice, and Matt Kaulig went to see Eckes run at, I believe it was IRP, which would have been in July, I believe they raced there. So like they were in serious discussions there where they thought it was happening even back then. And I guess there was an incident where Eckes was pretty heated after the race. I don't know what that incident was. I didn't see the race. In fact, it's really hard to see truck races up here in Canada. Canada does not have a great truck series TV option at the moment. But they spoke a little bit about him being extremely heated and passionate, and obviously has the drive to want to win, but that he also didn't deal with it in a horrible manner. He didn't go and swing fists at anybody or completely finger point, but that he dealt with it in a mature manner, yet was still very passionate about it. Do you recall them talking about that? Can you add any more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got that exactly right. Rice said that was really what got Matt Kaulig specifically really interested in him as a driver. I think Matt is looking for a lot of maturity in the drivers, is kind of the sense I got. But it also got Allmendinger interested. And Allmendinger sort of becoming the linchpin for these drivers. He talked about the Daniel Dye signing. Allmendinger is the guy that Rice goes to ask whether the drivers they want would be a good fit in the team. Allmendinger really is, as the elder statesman of Kaulig, really is setting the tone for what the Xfinity program, what the younger drivers are, moving the team forward. So that was what got Matt Kaulig interested, but it also very critically, I think, pushed AJ Allmendinger, seemed like, over the edge. This is our guy.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on AJ here shortly. You mentioned Daniel Dye earlier. What do you think Daniel Dye brings to the table for Kaulig? I don't think they specifically said it in the presser last week. I don't know if Chris Rice said it to you, but someone had out there that the Daniel Dye deal was a multi-year deal as well. Daniel Dye has obviously funding Race to Stop Suicide, Champion Containers. I believe there's others that Chris Rice confirmed on a Sirius XM hit would be joining him in the Cup Series. So he has funding. That helps in NASCAR. That's a topic we'll get to here shortly. But, for me, when I look at Dye and Eckes, who are both McNally drivers, Kaulig's basically robbed them of their roster at this point. I view them as two different levels of prospects, right? And that's not a shot at Daniel Dye, because Daniel Dye, who, I'll be honest, I hadn't really heard of heading into this year, has impressed me in the starts he's made in the Xfinity Series. He's flat out outrun Josh Williams in his starts, and I like Josh Williams. Obviously, that car's underperformed this year, but I look at Daniel Dye as kind of like your long term. You're building him up 3 or 4 years from now. Maybe he makes the transition to Cup with some of the funding he has. Where Eckes, I feel like whoever gets named to that 31 car, which we'll talk about as well, they have a bad year next year or not much funding. Eckes might be up in 26 or 27 for a ride, or when AJ retires. Is that how you kind of see the dynamic between those two, or do you consider them more even than that?
I think Kaulig's never going to go out and say they have a 1 and 2 driver, but I think you're right. I think that some of the sponsorship backing is a lot of the reason why Dye is in that car. I think it was a little bit more of a surprise than Eckes. He's not quite the same level of prospect. He's yet to win in the trucks, but he's shown speed. He's come close. He's also impressed a lot of people with his pretty admirable campaign with Race to Stop Suicide, a big partner for him, especially as a young driver, to have a partnership like that going. But I think the funding is a big part of why he's in that car. It's really, as colleagues talk, Chris Rice keeps talking about going back to getting trophies, going back to trophy hunting. That takes funding. So I think he's a young driver who has a kind of good balance of potential and speed, but also some money behind him.
I believe in today's presser, Chris Rice kind of unpromptedly, after he spoke about AJ's role in recruiting Eckes, went back to Dye and said something along the lines of AJ wasn't sure about Daniel Dye at first because he didn't really know much about him, but over time, obviously, they spent a lot of time together this year. He's pretty sold on him. Can you touch on that at all?
I mean, I think you got that exactly right again. He talked about seeing some of his Xfinity starts and just seeing the speed that the young driver has, and I think the starts prove it. The stat line proves it. He has speed. I think he will be competitive. It might take a little bit of time to adapt to the car, adapt to the team, but I think he has a shot, and I don't think Kaulig is going to treat him as a number 2 driver or anything like that.
My guy, the whole reason that I kind of fell in love with the Kaulig team is AJ Allmendinger. I've been an Allmendinger fan since he was driving probably the 10 car for Gillette Abraham Racing. I followed him in Red Bull, but just something about the way he would handle his interviews back then really caught me. He was passionate, didn't mince words, spoke truthfully about how he was driving or how others were driving. Certainly didn't mind rubbing people the wrong way. Doesn't come from a ton of money. Has never really brought a bunch of funding with him. Has driven his ass off to get the rides that he has. Obviously, he had that hiccup with Penske in 2012, but then became the poster boy of how you recover from a situation like that and get back into the sport. You mentioned it earlier, like Allmendinger, who has 3 years left on Chris Rice did an interview earlier this year and said that AJ had signed through 2027 with the team with an option to 2028. I know there's people that look at that and are just baffled by it because he's 42 years old, but I think it's important to remember that one, AJ got started late in NASCAR, and two, he took a couple of years off, so he had that time to spend away from the sport to an extent. And then even when he came back, the first 2 years he was back was, first year was extremely part-time, and the second year was still part-time. So, he's had a chance to revitalize himself. I've heard him talk in interviews about him wanting his son to see him drive. Obviously, at that age, if there's a big performance dip, then you start to consider retirement a little bit more. But it seems like he's locked into that ride. But more importantly, in every one of these interviews and pressers that Chris Rice seems to do with you guys, he makes adamantly clear how important AJ Allmendinger is to that organization. Mentioned that, basically he's a Kaulig lifer, more than likely will never drive for another organization, and even after he retires, likely is going to run part-time with them at some point and be a big part of that team. I think there's a lot of people that if you would have told them 5 years ago AJ Allmendinger was in a position like this with any NASCAR team, they would have said you're nuts. What do you personally see when you're at the track with AJ and how he handles himself around his teammates and, just with Chris Rice and Matt Kaulig? He really has made the foundation of that team. Not to put it all on one guy, because obviously Justin Haley deserves credit for his time there, Ross Chastain, but Kaulig is principally an AJ Allmendinger driven team at this point.
Well, I'll say Chris Rice put it all on one guy. He talked about in the presser of one guy brought us from 0 to 28 wins, and that's AJ Allmendinger. So I think what I see from him, what I see at all these press releases, is a real leader within the team, someone who has a really good kind of good interaction with all of his teammates, even his future teammates. Very jovial, lots of jokes between them. And someone I think they all look up to as sort of the elder statesman within the team. What's interesting to me is the fact that obviously he'll be in Cup next year. He made that announcement. What was surprising was that it was a really quiet announcement. No press release, no anything, just a press release just to say, he's in Cup, but no actual real announcement at the track or anything. He's moved up and down a few times. He's made some starts even in both series this year. Obviously, he won most recently in Cup at the Roval a couple of years back. But what I think is interesting is we won't really see him, at least as Rice said today, we won't see him in the Xfinity series going forward. Rice says he really wants to focus on developing both those teams and thinks that having his drivers making part-time starts all throughout, like the team has really done in the past, has contributed to some of the problems they have. So he wants his Cup drivers, which will be Allmendinger and someone to be announced, and his Xfinity drivers to really focus all on their program and not make any starts in the other division.
Yeah, I seen that he threw out the caveat, though, which, I know some people don't like when, whether it's reporters or journalists, fans, even people inside NASCAR talk about funding too much. But, at the end of the day, this is a business. There's a charter deal pending where the money's basically figured out. It's the other stuff that they got to figure out that's going to grant, every single charter, upwards of 8 figures a year. It's a business, and money is a very, very big deal. Danny Hamlin's talked at length about, it costs, minimum $18 million a year to run just one team at a semi-competitive level, which is a ton of money. As a guy who's a bus driver up here in Canada, that's staggering to think about that amount of money. But funding becomes an issue in some of these cases, and I don't think people get thrilled when people mention about said driver losing their ride because of funding. AJ Allmendinger finished 21st in points last year, won a race in the playoffs, and at one point, I think 4 races before the playoffs, was sitting 18th in points, something like 80-something out of the playoffs, reachable. Had a couple of bad races and then basically had to win to get in. He didn't. To me, that's not a season that's probably worth a demotion. But Kaulig lost a longtime partner in Nutrient Ag, and all of a sudden, AJ Allmendinger's out. Daniel Hemric's up. AJ's back to Xfinity, and I know they've said that they wanted AJ to go down and try to figure out the Xfinity program, but Chris Rice has also said, hey, it was a funding issue, too, that ended up costing AJ the ride. Chris Rice did let it slip in a tweet on, we actually have the tweet, but we won't put it out there, that he expects AJ in the Cup car for multiple years. You mentioned that the Cup drivers aren't expected to make Xfinity starts next year unless a partner, really pushes for it, aka if you pay us a lot of money, then we'll do it. Just talking about the funding before we get to the 31 car, how much is that a conversation? Like, obviously, silly season heats up on the internet and on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. I can only imagine how much the silly season talk heats up year over year, just in the NASCAR garage and in the media center and stuff. But ultimately, it feels like every one of these decisions almost always comes down to funding, even more so than talent. How big of a role in your eyes does funding play into getting, at least talking about the Cup Series, getting a Cup Series ride compared to talent? Like, obviously you want both, but it seems like funding wins out more often than not.
Well, money makes the world go round. Like you say, it is a business, and funding is definitely a decider in most NASCAR signings. And not every driver is a Kyle Larson who can be sponsored by his team owner for the majority of races. And that's an incredible talent, but realistically, most teams just can't do that. And unfortunately, it means some drivers who slip through the cracks. A big one for me is Ryan Truex, who won at Daytona in the Xfinity Series last week at Daytona. We talked to, and he said, he's really looking for opportunities. But it really, I think if he had funding to bring, it would probably be a lot easier. Obviously, he's won 3 times. He probably, in part-time starts, 2 out of 8 starts this year he's won in. But it really is, thinking about some of the drivers who have the opportunity to get seats next year, a lot of the question is how much money can they bring to a team? So yeah, definitely guides the silly season discussion, yes.
Obviously, some teams are fortunate enough to have sponsors aligned to them and not the driver, which gives them a little more leniency in terms of who they name to the car. Situation that's brewing, at least rumored to be brewing, is Kroger maybe going to RFK, which may allow them to add a third car because they already have a bunch of sponsors locked up for the following season. The Kaulig group has a little bit of an advantage in this area where I don't think Matt Kaulig minds having Leaf Filter on the car or Action Industries or Ellsworth Advisors. But I think there's a difference between having them on your car 5 or 6 times in a Cup season compared to 20. These aren't massive companies, but they'll have their marketing budgets to their own right. And, it gives them a little bit of an advantage, but they're certainly not Rick Hendrick with HendrickCars.com, who I believe funds 90% of Kyle Larson's season, it seems like. So they have that distinct advantage there. And speaking of funding, that brings us to the 31 car, which I noticed Chris Rice said at the end of the public presser, we hope to announce some more things for you soon. Through process of elimination here, bear with me, there's a bunch of drivers, and everyone's going to name a bunch of drivers. Why don't they get this guy or that guy? And I get it. Like, as a Kaulig fan, I sit here and go, well, if Zane Smith hasn't definitively linked up with FRM, why isn't that a conversation? Chandler Smith, you might say there's some bad blood between him and the organization, but he brings a little bit of funding. Obviously, a talented kid. Although I can't help but wonder, there's some people take some shots at his maturity. And I can't help but wonder when talking about Daniel Dye and Christian Eckes in the last couple of weeks, they keep using that maturity word front and center. Now, I'm not saying that's a shot at Chandler Smith, but it seems to be a knock on him from what I gather. And then, there's Harrison Burton. Ryan Preece might end up in RFK or somewhere else. Corey LaJoy, we've heard at least rumored to a truck ride. To me, it kind of comes down to two, maybe three guys. There's Daniel Hemric, which you guys had a great piece on last week that I'd love you to touch on, because I thought that your piece was more informative than anyone else who covered that interview last week. Daniel Hemric being one of the guys, and Ty Dillon being another. Now, I would argue you also touched on the RCR Kaulig Welcome One, whatever it is that means. They're more extensive relationship that they've built. Maybe that gives them an option to promote Austin Hill to the ride, but to my knowledge, Austin Hill has a year left in Xfinity. Maybe there's a domino effect where Austin Hill ends up in the 31 and Ty Dillon ends up in Austin Hill's ride. I don't think that's going to be the case, though. Chris Rice made a point of mentioning to, I believe it was Claire Lang today, that, hey, we do things differently. We run our team like a family. You might have mentioned something similar to everybody. I can't remember. But, Kaulig Racing's a family, different atmosphere. We do things a little differently than a lot of other teams. But, you got to be able to fit in their culture. And you'll notice that the guys here, the other drivers from Kaulig Racing, are here supporting Daniel Dye last week, supporting Christian Eckes this week. And I had mentioned to you, so the 31 car, man, it feels like it's down to Ty Dillon or Daniel Hemric. I was just mentioning how Kaulig Racing has this family atmosphere. Chris Rice made a point of singling out the drivers, supporting Daniel Dye last week, supporting Christian Eckes this week, the drivers of Kaulig Racing, that is. And you'll notice that those drivers were Josh Williams and AJ Allmendinger, and suspiciously missing both times was Daniel Hemric. And I think if it was one time, you could write it off as, maybe not anything. He could have been busy with something, but back-to-back weeks, back-to-back new drivers. It should be noted, though, that Matt Kaulig wasn't at either these things either. But he was nowhere to be seen, man. You did an interview with him. Some others did some interviews with him. Chris Rice was asked about him. What do you think's going on there? Because the way that we read it, and we've spoken with someone other than you who firmly believes he's out at Kaulig. Now, until they announce anything, we don't know, but it seems like all signs are pointing to Daniel Hemric's time being up at Kaulig. And I'm not saying there's bad blood there. I think Daniel Hemric's a good guy. Everyone's interactions that I've heard they've had with him, he seems like a very approachable dude. So it's a bit surprising that he's not there, but NASCAR is a bit of a dog-eat-dog sport, and in my time watching it, man, I have watched driver A, B, or C bring a sponsor into a team as their sponsor, and then that driver gets relieved from the team, and more often than not, that sponsor goes with them. However, there are occasions where that sponsor doesn't go with him, and that sponsor sticks with the team, and the driver ends up leaving, and that obviously creates more friction, more bad blood. And I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but I'm also not ruling it out. So what do you think's happening? First off, with Daniel Hemric, before we speculate on anyone else.
Well, I think what I always like to say about the sport is it's a zero-sum game. Whenever there's a cool announcement, some new driver getting a good ride, there's always the other driver who missed out or something else like that. I think on the Hemric situation, I got the chance to talk to him on the day of the Daniel Dye announcement, get his thoughts kind of immediately after. And he told me, I'm excited for Daniel. I think he's a great driver for the organization. But, as far as my stuff, I'm still on the outside looking in, is a quote from him. That really doesn't seem to me like he's got anything moving forward with the team, especially when Rice told me that same day that the Cup stuff was not exactly signed, but was pretty close to it. That just seems like Hemric and he are on very different pages. I think Dillon makes sense realistically. We talked about the one welcome, the kind of alliance with RCR, whatever form that will take. It makes sense to have the Childress driver that is Ty Dillon in that seat, especially given what Rice tells me the Cup seat is. And that is really, he told me last week pretty much point blank, the point of the Cup program is to attract young drivers with a route to Cup. And both Rice and Eckes confirmed today that Cup is the goal at some point in the future. So I feel like the second Cup seat for this point in time is really just a bit of a placeholder until either Eckes or Dye gets in that car. So whoever fills it, I think, is going to have to come with funding. It seems like Poppy Bang Circle really aren't aligned as well with Hemric as they were at the time, or they were last year when he got the deal. And for now, I think it's just going to be whoever brings the money, whoever brings perhaps the arrangement with RCR.
We've been, I'm going to backtrack really briefly here. We spoke about, you and I anyways, about AJ Allmendinger having a, I guess Kaulig Racing more so having a new long-term sponsor partner that they have not announced yet, that allowed AJ Allmendinger to go Cup racing. Whether that's Strive Funds, who's paying for AJ to run the Dega Cup race later on, or someone else, I don't know. But my co-host Ryan and I have noticed this year, Daniel Hemric's been in the Kaulig organization for a few years now, and never has Circle sponsored another driver in the Kaulig organization than Daniel Hemric. And that has changed this year. I believe they have sponsored AJ Allmendinger twice in Cup and 3 times in Xfinity. Now, I'm not saying that that's where it's going, but it does make me wonder if something like that has happened with the team in terms of, Hemric brings in a sponsor, the results aren't there, sponsor may stick with Kaulig in a smaller capacity, and then, just speaking about Hemric, because I feel bad for fans. I never want to crap on anyone's favorite driver. That's not what I'm about. As an Allmendinger fan, believe me, I had to deal with a lot of that in RPM days. But it's really late in the game, man, to potentially lose your ride, and there's not a lot of openings. And when I say there's not a lot of openings now, I'm not talking Cup Series. I'm talking all together across all 3 series. Is there enough time for him to land something full time that's not going to be a back of the pack thing in a lesser series?
I really don't know. It seems like he doesn't really have his plans together based on what I talked about. But go back to what you talked about with Circle. It's the reality of having a personal sponsor. If you're basing your ride on those personal sponsorships and those personal sponsorships go away or become team sponsorships, then I really don't see that ride continuing. And I think I that's the sense I get. I don't know anything deeper with Hemric's talks with the team than what he told me there. But I mean, that's how I read what he told me. It just doesn't seem aligned with where Rice thinks the team is at in the team's negotiations.
And I don't know if people understand how wealthy Richard Childress is, but he does okay for himself. And even if Ty Dillon doesn't have the support that he had a couple years ago, my guess is, RCR themselves can fund the ride for a year or even 2 if necessary. I want to go to SVG here because I know there's going to be people waiting for us to talk about it. You and I talked about it briefly today. Sometimes there's a clear crisscross of signals. And I think if you were to listen to SVG's 88 press conference with Trackhouse last week and listen to Chris Rice today, you might be sitting there scratching your head. Last week, SVG all but said that he would likely be running Xfinity races with Kaulig next year. And today, Chris Rice said, we're not doing a 4th car. It's 3 cars. And obviously there's another rumor out there where Kaulig might be preparing a car for someone else, whether that comes to be or not. I can see why that might diminish their resources to have a 4th car. What do you make of that? Because this is a driver who's still actively driving for them, probably doesn't have a great shot at winning the Xfinity Championship, being after the Roval. We're going to, it's strictly ovals after that. But that, for me personally, could not be more confused by that situation, because we ran right here on this channel that, hey, you could expect SVG back in the Kaulig Xfinity car next year. And, we just sort of assumed AJ would run his allotted 5 races in Xfinity. Clearly that probably isn't going to be the case. What do you make of this, man? Because I think there's a lot of confusion right now.
Yeah, I asked Rice exactly that question. Are you going to have a fourth car for part-time starts for AJ SVG? And he said, no, that's not in the works. And it does directly conflict with what SVG said last week, which is that he wants to. He name dropped Kaulig. He said he wants to make some Xfinity starts in Kaulig equipment potentially. He never said anything with necessarily finalized. Obviously, clearly it wasn't, or that talks had really reached any point more than that he wanted to do it. But yeah, it definitely seems like maybe what he won't get what he wants there. But the other thing just to say is he does not have the 5-driver limit. Or the 5-race limit. He, as a rookie in the Cup Series, can run as many races as he wants. The 5-driver limit applies in the third year for drivers who've done 3 years of Cup Series.
Well, I mean, Junior Motorsports just so happens to be hosting another Trackhouse driver, and to my knowledge, I only count 3 drivers over there for next season at this point in time. So it's just weird because obviously things have changed. You had the write up about One Welcome or Welcome One, the Kaulig RCR Alliance, which we'll touch on in a moment. But like, if you go back and listen to some Chris Rice interviews from, I'd say 3 months ago, he says that they will continue to work with Trackhouse in the future, even after this year. Well, outside of the pit crew thing, man, it seems like that relationship is almost completely diminished heading into next year, and it's become more of a Kaulig RCR thing. What do you make of the Kaulig RCR thing? Because we get asked this. We've been asked it on social media. We've been asked it on our YouTube channel. They already have an alliance together. There's a technical alliance there. They get ECR engines. Chris Rice quite literally on a Sirius XM called and said, hey, we're one team now, unofficially 2 owners, officially 2 owners, officially 2 names, unofficially 1 big team, 1 welcome. I know he was pretty vague with you too, but like, maybe you can offer some insight in what do you think this means? Does it mean Kaulig could potentially receive more Chevy support now, or RCR will be more willing to show them support? I know Chris Rice specifically used this wording last week that there's no money changing hands or anything like that. And I got to tell you, you said the quote earlier in this video that money makes the world turn. I have a hard time believing that. And we're only a few years removed, by the way, of some rumors getting out there that Matt Kaulig might be interested in buying RCR. Not saying that's what's happening, but oddly enough, some of the same places that ran the rumor about Rev Racing and Nick Sanchez possibly running Kaulig equipment next year. Is there a long-term goal here in sight where Matt Kaulig might buy RCR? But more specifically, how is it really any different than what's going on now? Because
I think you're completely right when you say they're not giving me any details. I asked Rice point blank, what is this looking like? What is one welcome? What does any of this mean? And he just said, it's a marriage between our 2 teams. We want to leave Welcome North Carolina, where both teams are based. We want to leave as one team. We want to race as one. But what that really means, I really don't know. The one thing that I would point out kind of to support potentially what it will look like in the future is Eckes talked to me when I asked him about seeing the future for Kaulig Racing. He said not only is Kaulig Racing on an upward streak on a potential future growth, but RCR is too, which seemed to me to hint that the teams are really kind of intrinsically tied going forward. But that's really all I got. I really have I don't have an indication of what those teams are going to look like, and Rice wouldn't give it. I know multiple of us asked him. He had a little bit of a personal availability after the full press conference. I know multiple of us asked him that question. He gave the same response every time.
So, without having any concrete info, you might understand why RCR fans go, how does this benefit us at all? And you might say Kaulig fans go, okay, so what more are we getting out of this than what we already have? Like, you can have that one team approach, on super speedway racing, but like, do you think there's more to be revealed here at a later date that they're just not either able or allowed to say at this point?
I think there definitely has to be something more revealed, more than just, we're going to leave with our haulers together. That's not much of an alliance. I think there's got to be some element. I think we talk about Ty Dillon in the car. I think there's got to be some degree of driver sharing, maybe pit crew sharing, like the team has had with Trackhouse in the past. I think there's going to be elements of that kind of. I see it as sort of RCR's Xfinity program as a potential interpretation of what that group might look like. But again, I really don't have an indication. I asked, I got nothing. We'll see what happens going forward, but they're definitely being cagey about it.
Yeah, very much so. Not to mention, like, the one thing that seems locked for next year in terms of the charter stuff is outside of Gibbs and Hemric, all the other teams are only allowed 3 charters. So if there is something official that's going to come down the pipeline, it would need some sort of NASCAR approval, because I count 4 charters between the 2 teams. It's very weird. I've heard him say it to you guys in the presser. I've heard him on Sirius. It's that exact quote that you just gave, and everyone just sort of goes, okay, so this is going to make Kaulig better. How? And clearly there's something there, but we just don't know it. RCR is still a Tier 1 Chevy team, correct?
Yes, to my understanding, yes.
Yeah,
they were an old engine supplier. They still have that arrangement, yeah.
Yeah, Kaulig is not in the Cup Series. They are in the Xfinity Series, so maybe it means they receive some of that Tier 1 support unofficially too. I don't know, but until we get answers on this, it has everyone a little puzzled. My last question I have for you, man. Obviously, the schedules finally came out to everybody's great pleasure, as people have been lobbying for it for seemingly 2 months now on social media nonstop. I can tell you firsthand that Montreal was definitely in talks for the second year in a row. And once again, thank you to the province of Quebec for making things difficult. It is not happening again, which is unfortunate, because I think Circuit de Villeneuve is one of the nicest, most state-of-the-art racing facilities that there is in the world. I also really like Mexico. But your thoughts, I guess, for some of our Canadian contingent fans here, is there going to be talks, do you think, for a third year in a row? Is it just something that's just not getting across the finish line? Or, it seems like we keep getting the lollipop thrown in front of us Canadians up here, and then having it taken away. I know the Mexico deal is multi-year, and it sounds like according to, I think it was Adam Stern that put it out there, seems like San Diego is going to get a street course in 2026. Not seeing a whole lot of room for Montreal to be able to get on the schedule here unless they expand the road courses. Not that I would complain about that, because I firmly love the road course racing in the Xfinity Series and the Cup Series. Just your thoughts, specifically focusing on the road course situation, street course, and Montreal.
Well, just talking about the road course situation where we're at now, I think the big element is NASCAR is working with a track promoter, the same promoter who does F1 in Mexico, and they reached an agreement with them. So I think it's an issue just in Canada of whichever promoter is running the track at this point. Obviously, NASCAR has an old relationship up in Canada. They ran, multiple different tracks up in Canada, even up till recently. But in order to get that Cup Series start, I think they just have to find. I think it's just working with the promoter, getting whatever deal they managed to get in Mexico City. I don't have the full details on that. I don't know exactly what it was, but there's some hiccup with the promoter and to some extent there. And I think we're seeing that it's just a problem of running. Obviously, Montreal, it's not necessarily in the city like some of these street courses are, but it's a problem of running these city races is getting all of these extra elements of permission where running right outside in Darlington County, South Carolina doesn't quite require. So it's a different style of racing than what NASCAR's kind of bread and butter is. But I think it's really interesting on that note of kind of NASCAR's bread and butter. My first thought with the schedule is, we're going international. We've got Chicago. We've got all these new things to attract new fans. But it's also a really interesting effort to kind of bring back NASCAR's more traditional fans and appease them with some of the offerings. We've got Bowman Gray Stadium in North Carolina, Rockingham Speedway in North Carolina. That means 4 North Carolina tracks on the schedule next year: Rockingham, Bowman Gray, Charlotte, and North Wilkesboro. So I think it's a really interesting effort to appease both the more traditional fans and some fans who want to see it go international, go on city center street courses, do a whole lot of massive variety of things. And that's what all the drivers I talked to today about the schedule, they echoed that thought.
Do you think that they would consider, obviously right now for the Cup Series, we're at 5 regular season road course, street course, whatever, and 1 playoff heading into next year. In the Xfinity Series, it's 6-1. Do you think they would entertain running multiple street courses in one season, or is this going to be, next year will be Chicago's last year sort of thing, and Chicago becomes San Diego sort of thing?
I think NASCAR's seen a tremendous amount of success in the Chicago program. They're getting still a huge amount of fans at the track. They're getting a huge amount of local media attention. I think if Chicago doesn't return, I think it's going to be an issue of Chicago itself rather than the street courses. I think NASCAR is going to try to get as many of those types of races as it realistically can, which is realistically means how well its fans will react to it. I don't think a schedule full of street courses would go over very well. But I see if NASCAR can get it multiple street courses at some point in the future. I think the races are just so popular with fans, maybe not traditional NASCAR fans, but I've been to Chicago both years. I absolutely love that race. And I've covered it both times. And the variety of fans that NASCAR doesn't get any other track is really interesting.
I know people think I'm nuts for saying this, but I firmly believe the sweet spot for the Cup Series is 8 races. Like, give us 8 street/road course races. That's still less than 25% of the schedule. I just enjoy the racing. Like, when the weather hasn't gotten in the way, Chicago has been fantastic. Like, it looks great. The F1 cars did the Vegas street course, I believe it was this year. It looked amazing under the lights. Like, I would hope that if they go San Diego or if they go, even Vegas at some point, that they go under the lights for a street course, because I think they look just incredible. In terms of the rest of the schedule, was there anything that really stood out to you? I know the one thing Ryan and I talk about is it would be really nice if it wasn't the same last track every single year. Not to knock Phoenix, but like, maybe get some variety in there and switch up that last race of the season now and then.
Yeah, I know we've talked about having Homestead at the end of the season. It's partially it's an element of, it's a NASCAR-owned track. They want to end on a NASCAR-owned track at Phoenix. There's all these negotiations with all the tracks together, who gets the final race. So that's a question for the track promoters, the track owners to discuss with NASCAR. Personally, I'd love to see Homestead back as the regular season, as the finale. But just talking about the regular season finale too, we're going to have Daytona back next year. This year, the race tomorrow at Darlington is the regular season finale. I talked to some drivers about that, got their thoughts, and the majority just said, it really doesn't matter. We're all racing at the same types of tracks. We're all facing the same challenge, especially with the regular season with the win in your own system. You had every other chance to win. It doesn't really matter what the last one is, other than maybe a little bit of extra motivation. But everyone's racing the same racetrack. I would love to see a track that maybe puts on a slightly better show than Phoenix with our short track package now. But it's going to come down to which track can offer NASCAR the best deal.
I mean, you mentioned Daytona at the end of the regular season. I used to be in an iRacing league years ago where we started at Daytona and we had our own playoff system as well. There was only about 25 cars in the league, but and guess what? We ended at Daytona too. I don't know if NASCAR would ever consider that, because obviously you need help while driving at a place like that. I mean, that would really get the teams pushing 4 different individuals at the end. That might get nuts, but I'll tell you what, it'd be entertaining to watch on TV. So anyways, man, we've kept you way too long. It is almost midnight on the East Coast here. You got a Darlington race tomorrow. Is it under the lights tomorrow night? I believe it is, right?
It is under the lights. We're starting at 6 tomorrow.
Weather forecast look good?
Weather forecast, knock on wood, it should be okay, but hopefully we get the full race in. Hopefully we're not up too late here in Darlington.
Yeah, well, I hope you get to enjoy some of your long weekend too, man. Owen Johnson from Cup Scene. Where can everybody find you at, dude? Whether it's social media, websites, partners, etc.
Yeah, read my writing over at cupscene.com. It's up on the screen there. And follow me on Twitter, Owen Johnson, Owen 4_ Johnson. I guess there's a lot of other Owen Johnsons who had that idea first, but got some underscores between it. And that's all my stuff. So thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much for being incredibly gracious with your time. And we look forward to hearing from you again in the future, man. Have a great end of your weekend and enjoy Darlington.
Thank you.